Welcome, class. Today we're going to be looking at a new genre of books, one I'm sure you're all familiar with, fairy tales. So, what are fairy tales? Fairy tales are defined as a children's story about magical and imaginary beings and lands. I want you to think of some. If you're having some trouble, here are a few you may be familiar with: Snow White, Cinderella, or even Rapunzel. Many of these titles have been made popular through a company called Disney. Disney often takes these stories' outlines and uses their structure to rebuild and refurbish the stories. This brings up my question: where did these stories come from and how did they become so well known? Over the next couple of minutes, we are going to go over the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, and we're also going to cover how. Let's start with how these stories came about. Have you ever heard of a folktale? A folktale is a story that tells traditional beliefs and customs passed through the community through word of mouth. The question then is, what does this have to do with fairy tales? Fairy tales for a long time were nothing more than stories that were shared but through word of mouth. It was not until two men started compiling traditional stories from their home that a genre called fairy tales became popular. This book would become known as Grimm's Brothers Fairy Tales. This brings us to our who. The Grimm's brothers, otherwise known as Jacob and Wilhelm, were the authors of this book right here, Grimm's Brothers Fairy Tales, and they managed to collect over 200 Germanic stories, fables, fairy tales, and folklore. Next, there was The Wind, and this book was originally published in 1812. However, as more stories came about, we do see this story continue to expand. The other issue that they faced was that once these books hit the shelves, they were extremely popular, especially among children, and for a lack of better words, these were not children-appropriate books. So in 1830, we start to see the revision of a lot of these original fairy tales. Finally, we're going to talk about the where. If you haven't caught on yet, these were based out of Germany because they were Germanic folk tales. And the brothers grew up in Germany, and they also went to school here, which is why this project all got started. While in the university, they decided to start collecting and compiling all these stories to make sure that they were preserved for future generations. The final question then becomes, what are the point of fairy tales, from the moderns to the classics? The main point was to share a story that taught a lesson to the listener. Think back to the stories that you have heard and the lessons that they taught. Can you think of any? This is our starting point for our introduction to fairy tales. Thank you for listening.